Of Stanley Park out in B.C. While he was in British Columbia this past week, he also met with a man who, probably more than any other, and long before environment became an issue almost, has become the face, the voice of the environmental movement in Canada, David Suzuki. Mr. Suzuki, thank you for your time this afternoon. I guess what I want to ask you first is, what has suddenly happened? Why has environment suddenly become, and the polls are showing, the most important issue in the minds of so many Canadians?
Well, I think Mother Nature has given us a huge hand up. It started with a series of events like Katrina. Certainly after Katrina, it was the first time in the United States that I went down and met people beginning to say, gee, do you think this is related to global warming? With the severe weather we've been having all across Canada, we've had floods and droughts and fires. Canadians have begun to realize, gee, this is not normal and we better start paying attention. And I want to remind you that this is not something that's just suddenly emerged. In 1988, climatologists were so worried that they issued a call for a 20% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in 15 years. That was in 1988, so it's almost 20 years later, and we're still behind the eight ball. I mean, we're finally catching up to an awareness. I mean, even Mr. Harper has had to admit that climate change is an issue of some concern. Now the problem is that it's all become very, very political. I don't think we can afford to make global warming and environmental issues a political issue. Otherwise, then the parties start jockeying and saying, I'm greener than them, I'm greener than... This is a fundamental issue that affects all of us, regardless of whether you're right or left wing. And we've got to get on with it.
I couldn't miss your saying, even Mr. Harper. It was your impression in the past that he didn't believe in the science?
I met Mr. Harper before he was even a leader of the parties. I happened to run into him while he was being interviewed in the Parliament buildings. And at that time, he was denying that global warming was an issue. And he was saying then, this is years and years ago, there's no way that we can meet a target like Kyoto, it's too expensive. Well, it's a hell of a lot more expensive now. And I certainly agree with the Conservatives that the Liberals were they just didn't do the hard things that were needed to meet the Kyoto target. But Mr. Harper certainly didn't have any intention of even trying to meet the Kyoto target. When he got in, what was the first thing he did? He abolished everything that the previous government had done to try in some way to reduce emissions. That's crazy. And then to say, oh, well, it's too late, we can't do anything, I think is a dereliction of responsibility. And one thing that I told Mr. Baird was that when Mr. Chrétien ratified Kyoto in 2002, he didn't ratify that as a Liberal. He ratified that as a Prime Minister of Canada. Canada ratified that treaty. And when Mr. Putin of Russia ratified in 2004, it became international law. We're now bound by that as an international agreement. And I think it's not what Canadians want to do, to say, oh, well, these international agreements, we can't meet them anyway, we're not going to do anything.
Was it clear to you?
You have a responsibility to try.
Was it clear to you that Mr. Baird seems committed? What was your impression of the new Environment Minister? Is this a new start? Do they get it?
When Ms. Ambrose was appointed, one of the first things she did was call me. And I saw her within a week of her appointment. She then came and visited my foundation twice. And when we talked to her, she seemed to be listening. What she said was great. So I kind of feel like I'm seeing the same movie again. This is all political posturing, and I understand what that is. So Mr. Baird called me within 2 hours after he was appointed. When I called him back, he said completely out of the blue, David, I want you to understand, I'm not a flat earther. I said, what do you mean? He said, I believe the information scientists are accumulating about global warming. I'm not denying its occurrence. Well, to me, that was a huge step up from what the previous minister had really been saying. So that was a very good start. He said, I think the scientific evidence is stronger than scientists are actually saying in public, and I want to get on with it. So now I think he started off well, he's telegenic. Ms. Ambrose was an absolute rookie, and I think what she ended up doing was being basically a mouthpiece for Mr. Harper. And now I asked Mr. Baird, what is Mr. Harper's position on global warming and meeting Kyoto? And then he became what I felt was really political. He waffled and he went round and round and round and round. So I think we've got to wait and now see. The photo op is done. Now let's see what can he actually deliver in terms of very hard targets and timelines to actually begin to reduce greenhouse gas emissions deeply.
The Conservatives are worried about British Columbia. They need to hang on to their seats there. They lost some last time. They want to regain them. What are the politics of this? How important is it for the Conservatives in BC that they do the right thing on global warming, climate change?
Well, I think that in this province we're seeing the enormous impact of climate change in the same way that the Inuit in the Arctic are seeing the impact in the melting of the permafrost and the problems with polar bears. But, you know, if you fly over the northern forest up towards Smithers in British Columbia, the shocking thing is our forest has turned bright red. And that's because of the invasion of the pine beetle. And it's devastating. Our forest is literally being demolished because pine beetles can no longer be controlled because winters aren't cold enough to kill them off. So British Columbia, like Newfoundlanders with the loss of their cod stocks, British Columbia is seeing the impact of environmental degradation. We're seeing the impact of rising sea levels, and certainly the storms that we've witnessed here that demolished Stanley Park is, again, a reminder that we are very, very vulnerable. I think Mr. Campbell, our Premier, has been very, very quiet on the environmental front, on global warming, and yet British Columbia is very vulnerable. Tourism is a major part of the economy of this province, and will be heavily impacted, as well as forestry and fisheries. And yet Mr. Campbell is pushing for drilling for oil off the coast of British Columbia. He wants to open up coal mines and open up 2 new coal-burning plants. I think Mr. Campbell is going to get hammered by British Columbians, and certainly Mr. Harper is going to have to make inroads in this and show British Columbians that he's serious about the environment.
Some people are suggesting we're watching basically a temporary flash in the pan, Euro environment panic, if you like. Is this lasting? Is this going to continue in your mind?
Well, one of the problems is people like you and me, we're journalists, and you know that the media had the concentration span of a hummingbird.
Yeah.
So in 1988, when I say that environmental issues were the absolute #1 around the world, I want to remind you, in 1988, a guy ran for president of the United States, and he said, if you elect me, I'll be an environmental president. That was George Bush, one of the worst environmental presidents we've ever had. 1988, Margaret Thatcher said on television, I'm a greenie too. Mulroney, he elevated the minister to the inner circle. So we saw a peak. Then the economy took over as the primary issue. I don't think that we can possibly allow this to decline again. There are too many pressing issues that haven't been dealt with. A lot of it depends on whether the media can sustain that interest and keep showing that this is an issue of great concern. So we'll have to see.
David Suzuki, great to talk to you. Thanks very much.
Thanks for having me.